Good evening and welcome to the 15 Drapers lecture. I would like to extend a particular welcome to Richard Winstanley, who is joining us from the Drapers company, and welcome to Queen Mary students, staff, council members and alumni who are also joining us tonight, as well as those from other institutions and elsewhere. While this may be the first time we've held the Drapers lecture online, it's pleasing that this has enabled so many people to join us this evening. Over the many years that it has run, the annual Drapers lecture in learning and teaching has considered a number of important issues and has been delivered by those at the heart of education policy and practice. This year is no different, and I'm delighted to welcome Professor Sian Bayne from the University of Edinburgh, who will be speaking on the future of digital education. Professor Stephanie Marshall, our Vice Principal for Education, will be saying more about this in a few minutes. This evening's Drapers lecture follows on from a highly successful Festival of Education held between the 8th and the 12th of March. I know that this evening will also offer thought-provoking insights and views on this highly current subject. Queen Mary has benefited from the support from the Drapers Company. The company makes an annual charitable grant to Queen Mary, which provides scholarships for students, support for initiatives to enhance the students' skills and experience, awards to recognise excellence and achievement by students and staff, a studentship for a research student, also funding for internships for students and grants for teaching and learning initiatives. Queen Mary and the Drapers Company also jointly sponsor the Drapers Multi-Academy Trust, which operates 5 schools in Harold Hill. Queen Mary student ambassadors deliver a range of activities at Drapers Academy in a scheme managed by Queen Mary Student Recruitment and Widening Participation Team, and also funded by the Drapers Company. I would like to thank Professor Sian Bayne for delivering this evening's lecture, to all those joining us this evening, and to the Drapers Company for their continued support to Queen Mary, University of London. I know that this is greatly appreciated by all those who benefit from it. I would now like to pass to Professor Stephanie Marshall, who will introduce this year's Drapers lecture.
Thank you very much, Colin. Good evening to you all. Further to the welcome from the President and Principal, I'm absolutely delighted to introduce this year's Drapers lecture, Professor Sian Bayne. Professor Bayne is a Professor of Digital Education at the University of Edinburgh and Director of Education at the Edinburgh Futures Institute. She also directs the Centre for Research in Digital Education. Professor Bayne's research is currently focused on higher education futures, interdisciplinary approaches to researching digital education and digital pedagogy. She's one of the authors of the Manifesto for Teaching Online, recently published by MIT Press. The title of this evening's lecture is The Future of Digital Education, as you can see, but given the developments seen over the past year, this could not be more relevant. Tonight's lecture follows on from our successful Festival of Education, which took place earlier this month, and in which we heard a range of perspectives on the shifts in education over the past year. Now, Professor Bayne will explore a range of possible futures for digital education and discuss some emerging sector-wide trends and what these might mean for us in teaching. In particular, this evening's lecture will see Sian discuss the digital education futures work that she led at the University of Edinburgh. That work aimed to enable a wide conversation to take place amongst Edinburgh students and staff around how they would like to see digital education grow in order to build a vision for the university which balances technological change with the values of the academic and student body. Sian is happy to take questions at the end of the evening's lecture. Please use the Ask Question function in Teams to submit your questions. Professor Janet de Wilde, Director of the Queen Mary Academy, will be putting these questions to Sian at the end of the lecture. I would like to offer thanks to Sian for agreeing to give this year's Drapers lecture, and to extend my thanks to the Drapers Company once again for their continued support. I do hope that each and every one of you enjoy this evening's lecture, and I look forward to discussing the themes raised tonight in the weeks and months to come. Thank you, and over to you then, please, Sian.
Hello, thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you, Colin, for that that very warm welcome, and thank you for the invitation to give this this year's Drapers lecture. It's a real honour. I hope that you can see on the screen my slides. A picture of a very sort of startled looking hare, and my title, which is, as Stephanie, as you said, it's the future of digital education, but for me with the important subtitle, and who gets to define it, and that's a theme that I'm going to keep returning to throughout my talk. The reason I've put this hare on my opening slide is not just because I love the image and I love the kind of wildness of the hare, but because the hare has become the kind of icon that we've used in my research group to represent our manifesto for teaching online, which you mentioned, Stephanie. The manifesto for teaching online, it really is quite it was published by MIT Press at the end of last year, and it's a really neat summary of a position that we take as a group on the future of digital education, but also of a research program that we have been developing in the Centre for Research in Digital Education for over a decade now. So I'm putting it on screen here in case you want to if you want to dig a bit deeper into any of the things that I talk about this evening. The manifesto book is probably one of the best ways to do it. Having said that, I want to base most of what I say this evening in the kind of current and contemporary literatures around digital education, and I have put all the talk references and links that I'll be using into a Google document, which you can link to from this link, and I'll paste that link into the Q&A after the talk, so you can follow through and hopefully easily pick up any references you would like to look into a bit more deeply. So having said all that, let me introduce what it is that I'm going to talk about this evening. I'm talking about the future of education. I'm talking about who gets to define it, and what the politics of the future of digital education might be, and what kind of trends we can expect to shape that future over the next decade or so. I mean, I want to talk in the first instance about three particularly interesting sector trends that I see as kind of working to change what we do in university teaching, because of the last year that we've been through. It's been a really tough year for most of us. We hope that we're coming out of it now. I think we have learned a lot from this last year, and when we look back, we will recognise that it's sort of helped us map a very particular, and I hope quite kind of empowered path toward the future of the digital education that we as universities want. But I think there are three particularly interesting trends. The first one I will talk about is the issue of mobility. In a year when we have been prevented from moving around as much as we would have liked to, I think we have learned to think differently about what mobility might mean for our students. And I think that will lead to some interesting changes over the coming years. The second trend I will talk about is that I think we have become quite experienced innovators over the last year, although it might feel like we haven't, because much of what we've been doing has been in emergency mode and has felt often like it's not as good as it could have been, or we needed longer to do it. Actually, as a sector and as academics who are professional teachers, we have learned an awful lot this last year, and I think that has given us some confidence to change some of the discourses around digital education away from the assumption that technology is driving change towards something a little bit more empowered, I hope. So I'll say a bit more about that. Then the third trend I'm going to talk about is relating to the power of platforms and the platform dependence that we have that has kind of become amplified over the last year as all our teaching practices have had to shift more or less to online. I want to say a little bit about the kind of the technological context of platforms and the relationships with platform providers that I think will also be changing our sector in the following decades. And then I'm going to set the second part of my talk will be about taking these trends into account. What do we want as universities? How do we want to define our own futures for digital education? How do we want to build on these trends and this kind of sector-wide trauma, to be honest, that we've experienced over the last year? And I'm going to, in introducing that idea, talk about the Near Future Teaching project that Stephanie mentioned, which was an attempt to co-design a future for digital education, specifically at the University of Edinburgh. But I'd like to share some of the methodologies and findings from that project with you this evening. So that's the general shape of the talk. I think I'll probably be talking for about 30 minutes or so, and after that, I'm very happy to take your questions. So to talk first about this idea of learning how to revalue mobility. The picture that you're looking at is a picture of my now colleague, James Lamb, who at the time this photograph was taken was actually a student on the master's programme in digital education that we run. James was at that point working on his dissertation for his master's. He and his partner just had a new baby. And I love this photograph because it makes me think about what do we mean actually when we talk about student mobility? Because I think often when we think about the mobility of our students, we think about it in terms of students going for years abroad, or students from international students coming to our cities and our campuses to study, or we think about our online distance programs and kind of enabling the university to reach out to kind of distant shores in a way it may not have done in historically. And often when we talk about that kind of mobility, we think about it in terms of movement and the ability and freedom to move around, and that's important. But often, and this is a piece of research that myself and colleagues did some years ago, often for students, mobility is just as much the ability and freedom to stay still. We did a piece of research in which we spoke to a lot of distance learning students. We asked them, what does it mean to be a student at Edinburgh who's never in Edinburgh? And many of the responses we got were about, being able to travel around the world. There's a quote here I'm putting up from the paper we wrote from that project. This was from a student who said, I'm traveling all over the world. I'm engaging with the course I'm taking from all these different cities. As long as I've got an internet access, I'm taking part. I can be highly mobile. We did have clusters of students who were highly mobile, but we had just as many students responding to us then who saw mobility as the freedom to remain within the domestic space, the freedom to remain still, to kind of craft their studies around their lives in a different way. So I think in the last year, as we've been moving through COVID, we've really had a chance to think about quite deeply about what mobility means, what it means to stay still as a student, what it means to move as a student, what it means to come to campus or not be on campus as a student. And there have been some quite interesting reports coming out around this sort of idea of mobility. One of the ones that I found quite helpful actually was a Deloitte report which came out in January, looking at major shifts for the post-COVID university in terms of the hybrid campus and the future of hybridity. And what this report suggested was basically that universities should be thinking about mobile pedagogies and about kind of blurring this boundary between what it means to be online and what it means to be on campus, and thereby, and by an extension of that, what it means to be a student. So this report, and it's coming from the corporate sector, not the academic sector, but it's saying some really interesting things about how we can develop new ways of teaching in classrooms that kind of move between online and face-to-face education, that give our students the ability to kind of reduce the friction between being a resident and being online. And thinking about how the academic calendar might change to enable that kind of engagement. And I do think that this is going to be a kind of persistent trend within higher education. These are certainly things that we're thinking about quite deeply at Edinburgh in the context of the Edinburgh Futures Institute. And when we think about student mobility, I think we also have to think about the university itself as a mobile space. And there's a body of theory here that I think really helps us, which is a mobilities theory, which kind of emerged in the 1990s as a way of sort of troubling and rethinking the idea of space. And what mobilities theory does is it asks us to rethink what we mean when we talk about the university, to think about the university not as a bounded space, a bounded campus space in which learning happens, but as a space of kind of flux and flow where humans, buildings, objects, machines, curricular, cafes all sort of come together and produce certain performances at certain places at certain times. And I think this is a really interesting theoretical dimension of mobility and what it might mean for the future of the university. To me, the image you're looking at on the screen now is the Golden Boy, which sits on top of the dome of the old college at Edinburgh University. But I think there are three particular ways in which mobilities theory helps us think about the future of digital education, particularly post-COVID. And one of these ways is to do with a move away from campus-centrism, this sort of assumption that the bounded space of the campus is what marks the authenticity of academic experience. I've been working in distance education for a long time now, and I think it's still true to say that distance education is seen as the other. It's the sort of it's the non-normal thing that happens in addition to real teaching, which happens on campus. And there's a strong theme running through our manifesto for teaching online, which is about not seeing online education as second best. It's kind of moving away from this assumption that somehow to be on campus is this marker of authenticity. And I think again, what's happened in higher education over the last year has really drawn attention to our tendency as a sector, particularly universities like Edinburgh, like QMUL, to be really focused on our campuses and to see the campuses as being at the heart of the student experience. And to a large extent it is, but I feel that is going to shift over coming years. Mobility theory, I think, helps us here because it flags this notion of sedentarism, which is this idea of staying still, this kind of privileging that I think we have seen in the university over, through its history of these clearly bounded and rooted spaces of the campus and privileging them over the places and territories of mobility, nomadism, distance education, mobile education. So I think mobility theory is a good place to look to understand how mobility and moving about can be theorized, can be emotionally felt, and how it is entangled with these kind of issues of power, politics, social justice. And I strongly recommend a paper to you if you want to dig a bit deeper into this, from Tim Creswell, who's written specifically about learning how to revalue mobility as we come out of COVID. It's a great paper. And again, I'll share the link after I finish speaking. In terms of what this might mean in practice for the way we design our education and our campuses and our programs of study, I think there are a few things, and these are all ideas that we're working with at the moment in the Edinburgh Futures Institute. But this idea of what would actually mean to design a program around the idea of mobility and student mobility rather than campus centrism. And I think this would mean giving students much more granular, inclusive sort of choice between choosing whether to be online or on campus at quite a granular course level rather than program level. I think it would be about enabling really flexible modes of enrolment, meaningfully designing in part-time, intermittent and lifelong education into our programs of study. And also, I think perhaps thinking about the task of course design as a kind of a bricolage, a kind of piecing together of the digital and the physical, and looking at how can we bring together online spaces with campus spaces to do something really interesting and innovative with our students in the future. And I think about this as a kind of post-digital sensibility. So post-digital being an understanding that the digital is no longer exceptional, it's no longer new, it's no longer different. Digital ways of being, of working, of teaching are fully embedded in our everyday lives as teachers and as students. So that point takes me on to my next key trend that I want to flag, which again, it connects with this idea of the post-digital and this idea that we've moved beyond digital now. And Nicholas Negroponte made this point first back in 1998. Look, even then he was saying the digital revolution is over. Digital is not where it's at anymore. And I think there's some interesting ideas to think with there when we think about the future of digital education, and kind of perhaps move away from this idea that digital education is something exceptional, or that technology is driving what we do as educators and will continue to drive what we do as educators. So I want to suggest in this part of my talk that, having come through the last year and having developed a lot of experience as educators in the digital, we are able to push back on these kind of what are often quite default deterministic approaches to education, saying, you know, we hear a lot, education is going to be driven, educational change is going to be driven by technological change. I think we've learned a wisdom over the last year which will help us kind of push back on that and think differently about it. I want to just share an idea that I found extremely useful from a fairly old paper now from Edward Hamilton and Norm Friesen, who talk about educational technology having been driven by two key ideas. The first is instrumentalism, this idea that technology is a kind of seen as a neutral means employed for ends which are determined independently by their users. So this is the kind of technology as tool way of seeing digital education. And we hear this a lot in the discourses around digital education, that it's a tool for achieving X, or digital can be leveraged to achieve Y. These all kind of treat technology as a tool. The other dominant way of thinking about technology that they flag is determinism, this idea that technology is just driving social practice, driving change, and there's nothing much we can do beyond kind of adapting to that, responding to it, riding with it. And we see again a lot of this in the kind of future of education kind of policy documents that talk harnessing the power of AI, for example, or leveraging or the avalanches or tsunamis of change coming over higher education. We see this discourse a lot. In the end, it's a fairly disempowering way of thinking about what it means to be an academic teacher or a professional teacher or a student. But it is in many contexts really the dominant mode of thinking about the future of digital education. I put a quote up on the screen from Karl Schwab, which came from the 2016 World Economic Forum, which was focused on the fourth industrial revolution and the radical changes being wrought by artificial intelligence, machine learning, and other computational kind of manifestations within society. So I like this quote from Karl Schwab because I think it's an interesting one to analyse kind of discursively. So I'll just read it out. He says, "We stand on the brink of a technological revolution that will fundamentally alter the way we live, work, and relate to one another. In its scale, scope, and complexity, the transformation will be unlike anything humankind has experienced before. We do not yet know how it will unfold, but one thing is clear: the response to it must be integrated, comprehensive, involving all stakeholders of the global polity." And I think if I just highlight a few of those kind of phrases within this quote, you can see that there's a really strongly deterministic driving of this idea of a technological revolution, which is out with beyond the control of human beings, is almost kind of a natural force in the way that it will fundamentally alter the way we live. It will completely transform what we do, again in a way that implies that as human beings and as professionals we have almost no control over it. We don't know how it's going to unfold. It has its own volition, it has its own life. The only thing we can do to it is respond to it. So it places us as kind of human beings, us as a society, into a responsive mode to this sort of avalanche of technological change. And this has been really a very sort of dominant theme running through the popular and some of the academic literatures around the future of technology generally. I've put some examples of fairly recent books up on the screen, this idea that artificial intelligence is a fundamental threat to the human era, the human beings have to kind of race against machines to survive AI, that there is a threat coming from artificial intelligence and automation, that the agenda is never that we are in control of the direction this change takes. It's always that change is inevitable. These technological forces are kind of impacting on our lives, and we're going to have to understand how to adapt to them. Again, you have to ask, well, where is the locus of control and agency over these technologies? And if it doesn't sit with us as academics, as teachers, as students, where does it sit? So I think I want to just move us away a little bit from that kind of deterministic, kind of inevitabilist assumption to say, well, actually, you know, what have we experienced over the last year as academics? And I think we have moved quite significantly from seeing technology within universities as being driven by technology itself to understanding, to becoming really quite experienced innovators in the way that we think about and engage with technology in our teaching. I mean, there have been lots of surveys and things recently about how technology has changed our teaching over the last year. I thought this recent one from earlier this month that was published by Wonky was a useful one. It asked teachers, how much has your experience of teaching shifted during the pandemic? And it was really interesting to see how overall there was a growth in confidence in using technology, a growth in willingness to experiment with digital technology, a higher awareness of digital technology, and a sense of achieving greater proficiency in digital technology. So you would hope that, traumatic though this last year has been, we've now come to this position where we feel more empowered as educators to assert our agency over technology and the direction of technological change, rather than see technology as driving change. So I'll return to that a bit in shortly when I talk about near future teaching. But before I do that, I want to just talk about the third kind of key trend that I see as shaping digital education post-COVID. And this is about the power of platforms and the relationships between universities and platform providers. There's a really interesting kind of body of critical research now around kind of digital educational platforms, and I'd strongly recommend this special issue of Critical Studies in Education, which is dedicated to looking at specifically at platforms. The argument here is that under the influence of digital platforms, and that influence has been massively amplified over the last year, educational practices are gradually changing form. So we're very much not in a kind of instrumental relation with platforms, in that we are using platforms as tools in a very real sense. And this has been the case for decades, but it's become more evident over the last year. Digital platforms are increasingly shaping education in terms of our pedagogy and our infrastructures for delivering teaching to our students. So again, I just want to reference another interesting report that's come out recently. There've been many of these. This is a really terrific one from Ben Williamson and Anna Hogan, and it was sponsored by Educational International, which is the global federation of teacher unions, and it's all about how there's a kind of creeping privatization of higher education through educational technology, which has become amplified throughout COVID. And the issues, the points that that the authors of this report raised are that COVID has been, because when the digital pivot happened, this time last year, some universities and colleges were well set up for shifting to online, others weren't. But across the board, there was a massively increased dependence on our platforms, our virtual learning environments, our video conferencing environments, and all the things that we've come to know so well over the last year. And because of this, there has been an opportunity, I think, seen within the markets for expanding the commercialization of higher education through educational technology. There have been massively lucrative new market opportunities for online learning platforms over the last year, and the extent of dependency on those platforms is now kind of becoming quite transformative for higher education. not always positively. I think there are issues with the kinds of pedagogies that are embedded within platforms and the ways in which they often require teachers to adapt their pedagogy to fit the platform rather than vice versa. And there have been lots of new public-private partnerships to deliver online over the last year, which have functioned to blur the boundaries between academia and industry. So I think there are some things to think about there which are potentially quite troubling. And before I go on to talk about near future teaching, I just wanted to flag a few examples of the ways in which those shifts are a little troubling. I think there has been a discourse across educational technology for several decades now, which has worked to kind of deprivilege the teacher, to kind of chip away in a way at academic professionalism and academics as professional teachers. And we see this a lot in some of the kind of, the champions of artificial intelligence and datafication of adaptive learning and machine learning and so on in education. They're saying, look, we won't need teachers anymore. This is an age-old kind of narrative, but the AI will teach our students, humans will become mentors and coaches. So it's a kind of deprofessionalization of teaching. Now, some of these projections are really basically quite silly. And the one that I've got up on the screen here comes from Futures platform, which is all about how AI is going to take over the task of teaching, or AI will stop teaching being boring, and it'll quadruple the speed of learning. So people will be able to take an entire college degree in just a month. Quite how that would ever work, I'm not sure, but it's almost a return to this kind of cyberspace fantasies of information downloads through headsets. There are all kinds of clearly quite silly promises and projections out there, but overall there has been this trend to see technology as stepping in to replace professional teachers. So another example that I quite like is from the IBM 5 and 5 prediction, which came out about 6 years ago now, and this was all about what the classroom of the future would look like. And if you dig into this a little bit, you see how it's kind of assuming that the smart classroom, sensors, data, analytics, all these things will take on the functions of the professional teacher in what for me is really quite a problematic way. So it says things like, the classroom will create a syllabus based on individual learning style and pace. The classroom of the future will learn about individual students over the course of their education and help them master the skills critical to meeting their goals. These are all things that teachers do. Teachers normally map curricula, help students master their goals, help them through understand difficult concepts, and so on. So there's a kind of discursive kind of erasure, if you like, of the teacher in some of these future predictions, and a replacement of that idea of the teacher as professional with the idea of the classroom as smart, or the AI as smarter. And I think this is an ongoing discourse, and we have to an extent seen it continued through COVID. This idea that there was a Pearson survey report came out last year, which talks about self-service learning and uses the results of its survey to say, now we've got ready access to online learning and online resources and short courses. Everyone believes that DIY learning is the future. And that little bit of text then drops in this kind of, we've got all this free stuff online, and then we've got declining trust in traditional education institutions, making everything, everything is going to be DIY. And I think there's a really troubling tendency to kind of slide in these kind of really profoundly kind of political and problematic kind of statements like, nobody trusts universities anymore, into a kind of championing of the online and the digital and the platform and the commercial provider. So I think there are some continuing kind of issues there that we're going to need to look at quite carefully. And again, this idea that we should as educational researchers think seriously about platforms and what they mean for the future of education, and critique them, and kind of move away from the tendency to that we see constructed in many of the kind of corporate discourses around the future of education, to move away from seeing education as in, and educators as in some kind of deficit mode, education as doomed or as being sort of colonized by these technologies. So this is perhaps a slightly less a kind of optimistic aspect of the kind of trends which I think are facing us over future years. So I'm moving into the second part of my talk now, which I want to speak about what other models might be available out there for us as educators, as communities of scholarship, which is what I believe a university is, and how we can push back on some of these negative trends, and how we can build on and amplify some of the positive things that I've talked about as well. The two reports that I've mentioned in this talk so far, very different reports. The Deloitte report and the Education International report actually both recommend quite similar things that we need to do as academic communities, which is to think about how we want to design our hybrid campuses or our education futures, how we want to imagine those futures. The Williamson and Hogan report talks about we need to develop alternative imaginaries which are based not on education and higher education as a market opportunity, but on higher education as a social and public good. And I think that, and I believe this is true, and that we need to, as universities, develop methodologies for making it possible. And so this leads me neatly into the near future teaching project, which I led over between 2017 and 2019. And it was really designed to do what myself and my colleague Michael Gallagher have kind of mentioned in a forthcoming paper. We want to push against this problematic future for teaching. We want to focus on the university as a community of scholarship, as a site of civic and social purpose, and push back on some of the negative futures which are forecast for us from different value perspectives, let's say. So I want to talk now about how we do this. How do we as universities work toward defining our own futures? And I'm going to use the Near Future Teaching Project as a way of kind of describing one way of doing that that we've developed. There are, of course, many others. So the Near Future Teaching Project, as I say, it started in 2017, finished in 2019. It was a kind of formal University of Edinburgh project to develop kind of medium-term vision for the future of digital education, and to understand where, as a university, we wanted to go with digital. So when I took on leadership of this project, I didn't really want to do this by committee. I wanted to use a kind of a co-design methodology and make this a very sort of participative project. So involve as many academic staff, professional services staff, students as I could in defining what this future was going to be. And I wanted to take a strongly values-led approach as well. So to establish, in the first instance, the values that we want to drive the future of digital education, and then work from there into thinking about what that might actually mean in practice. So the way the project worked was we used a kind of broadly a design thinking sort of methodology, where we started by defining the problem or a question, which in our case was, what is our preferred future for digital education at our university? And then we moved from there into a sort of discovery phase, where we looked at what values we wanted to shape this future, and we looked at what global trends are kind of impacting on that future. And then about kind of a third of the way into the project, we defined a set of values, moved from there to define a preferred future, and then we worked on developing a set of aims and objectives to achieve, to create that future, and looked at what actions we would need to get there. So the approach really was very much that the future isn't something that's happening to us. This is about the future as something that we want to build, that we want to design, that we want to create from our own values base. Excuse me. So I'm putting up the project process map so you can kind of see the broad shape of the project. I'll share a link to the project report so you can download it and look in more detail afterwards if you'd like to. But basically, the project had kind of three main phases. The first one was about community scoping. It was about taking the temperature of the community of scholarship, talking to people, running events, and we engaged with about 300 staff and students during that phase. In phase 2, we developed a set of kind of speculative future worlds and future scenarios within which the university might have to be sustainable, and I'll say a bit more about those later. And on the back of those scenarios, we developed a set of objectives and aims for our future. And once we'd done that, we then in phase 3 took those objectives out for testing with students and staff at Edinburgh, but also with high school students, our kind of future students and future graduates, and did a lot of testing of those ideas with those groups before finalising the vision and the strategy. So that was kind of how it worked. I mean, I think that probably the longest phase, as you might expect in any university the size of Edinburgh, we have 45,000 students and about 15,000 staff. It's a massive community. And we didn't particularly want to use a survey methodology for this, because we wanted kind of richer, kind of thicker, kind of perspectives on this. So we ran a lot of events over the first year of the project. We ran events which we thought would attract people, members of the university community who would want to have a conversation about digital education and its futures with us. So we ran some events were kind of based on understanding particular kinds of new technology, like the blockchain or Internet of Things or learning analytics. We got people into the room, we had talks, we did activities, we had conversations about the future that we would like to see. So there were some sort of tech-oriented ones. There were others which were more sort of community focused in different ways. So we ran a kind of creative workshops, we ran discussion forums with our Bayne liberation group, and so on. So we did lots of different kinds of events, and as I say, we engaged with about 300 people with those. And then we also did a lot of interviews with students. So we did a lot of vox pop interviews. We basically hung out outside the university main library and at kind of internal conferences and grabbed people to come and talk to us and give us their sense of what they would like the future of digital to look like at Edinburgh. And we spoke to about 50 people in this way, and then we edited down all those interviews into sort of thematic 3-minute videos. Again, if you're interested, they're all up on the website. So as a result of this, and it did take a little bit longer than we were expecting to do all this kind of co-design kind of work and with people, we were able to define a set of values to underpin the rest of the project. And those values were really, of course, they were based in an idea about what we wanted to do with our technologies, but they definitely weren't directly technology related, if you like. So our students and staff wanted us to think about broadly holistically about the student experience and what it means to be a student, and to try and understand how technology could help us shift away from the kind of assessment mechanisms which too often drive the learning that our students do, the tendency to over-assess students, the tendency to kind of instrumentalize our curricula through focusing primarily on assessment and performance. So people wanted a real shift away from that tendency. Unsurprisingly, there was a clear value emerged around wanting to ensure and meaningfully build diversity and justice into our curricula and the ways that we work and the way that we support students and the way that we work together as a community. We wanted technologies which enable us to develop good relationships. I think there was a strong perception that technology can kind of get in the way of relationships or distance people from each other. So the community wanted us to put relationships first and think about what that might mean for digital. And then there was a strong tendency to want more flexible ways of thinking about curricula and student journeys through education, more interdisciplinarity, more flexible online, offline journeys, more participation, more co-design of curricula. So those were the broad kind of values that emerged. So once we'd kind of defined those values, we could probably, to be honest, then have gone on and just determined a set of aims and objectives that related to those values. But we decided that we weren't quite ready to do that. We did have this question we needed to answer, which is what would a near future for teaching look like if it was based on these values? But we felt that before we could really answer that question, we needed to do another phase of design. So at this point, we actually worked with a really small Glasgow-based design agency who helped us design a series of really intensive, highly structured workshops with students and staff, which helped us to answer this question about our preferred near future for teaching. And part of the way in which we did that was to design these kind of 4 future worlds, if you like, within which universities would need to be able to thrive, and then to extract from that conversation what we would want universities to look like. So we designed these 4 worlds. The first one was around what if this future world, and to be honest, it sounds not very far from the world that we have right now, was defined by ubiquitous data, high levels of datafication, data-driven decision-making in every aspect of the university's activities, intensive marketization of the sector, tighter borders in a geopolitical sense, and more diversification of actors within the sector, so more private universities, more public-private partnerships, and so on. So that was one scenario we kind of brainstormed. The second one was around this idea of a new ecology. You know, what would universities look like if we seriously considered climate crisis and the eco bottom line as underpinning and the marker of success in everything we do, and so that was an interesting one to think about how the university would need to change to really meaningfully do that. The third one was around human-machine interdependence, and this idea of a future where we're so tightly connected to machines that it's sometimes hard to tell the boundaries between the two. So this is a world in which automation has completely reframed and reshaped jobs, for example, in which there's increased leisure for humans. What would a program of study look like if employability, for example, was not such of an issue? We thought that in this instance, a lot of higher education would suffer from human beings would suffer from ennui and boredom and a sense of the need to question what does it even mean to be human. So it was interesting to think about what programs of study might look like in that context. And then the fourth example that we brainstormed was around what if universities were run like Uber, that consumer power drove everything, that universities were entirely unbundled, all our programs of study were converted into micro-credentials and lifelong learning became the key driver, and educational institutions themselves were completely hollowed out. So these were all speculative, more or less speculative, but in many ways kind of feasible futures. So once we'd done some tight workshopping around these ideas, we were able to come up with a set of aims for the preferred future for our own university, and you can see them here. Our aims really became about technology to help us form community, technology to help us think in this post-digital way where we bring together the on-campus and the online in new kind of creative ways that enable new kinds of student journeys. Data fluency, understanding, but also being critical of the impact of computational data, algorithmic decision-making on universities. Boundary challenging in the sense that we want to understand how technology can help us breach disciplinary boundaries, breach geographical boundaries in new ways, and so on. We wanted to continue to think about how technology could help us reframe assessment. And then finally, we wanted to understand how we could shift educational technology and put it to an extent back in the hands of teachers and students. Yes, of course, we all need our technological infrastructures, our virtual learning environments, and so on. But how can we also, as academics and students, get creative and hands-on, with research and development for our own digital education in much more micro contexts? So those were the aims that we got. I won't talk about the actions that we kind of defined go alongside those, but you can see those in the report. And although this piece of work was done before COVID was even heard of, actually looking back at them now, most of it still holds whole visit strongly values-based, it was strongly research-based. We're in a position now, I think, at Edinburgh, as we kind of enter another period of change. We have a big curriculum transformation project just getting underway. We're going to be able to return to the outcomes of the Near Future Teaching Project to understand and develop a really nuanced view on what the role of digital education needs to be for the next 10, 20, 50 years. So I'm coming to the end of my talk now, but I just want to kind of summarise what I've covered before opening up for questions. So I've made the point that COVID has changed higher education teaching, probably permanently. It's opened new ways of thinking about and revaluing mobility. It's also presented us with a challenge of thinking about how we design our offer on the basis of mobility. And I've talked about how I think we've become a community of quite experienced innovators over the last year, and I think that is all to the good, because it means we will be able to push back on some of the determinism that I've spoken about. And then I've talked a bit about how commercial edtech interests have been strengthened and amplified over the last year, and that's something that we need to give some thought to as we move into the future. I then made the point that there are some strong narratives of the future for higher education emerging and have been emerging over the last 3 decades around technology as replacing teachers or replacing aspects of the teacher function. And I've suggested that we as communities of scholarship need to take a stronger position and have more compelling stories to tell about our own futures, so that we can push back on some of these. And then, my overarching conclusion really is that we need, I think, as universities, we need a strong research base in digital education, and we need these confident, co-produced visions so that we can move forward positively, because I think the future holds many good things for us as well as some challenges. So I'm going to stop there. I'm happy to take questions, and I will put the link to the references up in the chat once the Q&A starts. Thank you so much for listening to me, and it's been a pleasure, and I'm looking forward to hearing your questions. Thank you.
Sian, thank you so much. That was just a great presentation. It was beautiful in every respect as well. I think I particularly liked your approach to the values-led developments and underpinnings to the pedagogic approach, whether it be your hybrid approach or your digital, which is something that we're trying to do here. But I think the way you embodied that was just wonderful. There are a couple of takeaways from me I'd just like to highlight, just because we've been in the midst of, through our Festival of Education a week ago, really reflecting on what the past year has meant for us in terms of that rapid pivot to online, which took us by such surprise, as I think it did globally. But I think, as you say, we're all innovators now, sort of approach, with some absolutely star and stellar innovators, both staff and students alike. But I think you tonight are now taking us in that realm of really let's shape our future and be really confident about what we're doing in this co-creation space. But I think 3 things, if I could just flag, please, takeaways from me, and I know others will pick up on a lot of things, that whole rethinking ideas of space. I think you've given us so many ideas now as to how we might do that, which is absolutely great, because we ponder on these things, but often external stimulus comes in and can really then help think, Joel, yes, we've got to think about that. I love the definition of the post-digital campus, where the embedded digital is the norm, because I'm not sure we've got to that point of thinking like that, but we should do, because that is actually, in essence, what our whole 2030 strategy is about when we're looking at the education side. And then thirdly, I think that I know colleagues will, and our community of practice here at Queen Mary, both staff and students, would love to do, is getting even more creative and hands-on approaches to our education. How can we really get creative? Because we've got some great thinkers. Our students are so creative. Sometimes they become a bit hidebound when you stick with traditional methods to include traditional assessment, which of course, like others, we're rapidly moving away from to try to get everything authentic. So thank you so much. I really look forward to hearing what colleagues are asking in the form of questions, because I'm sure that they've been really, will have stimulated their thinking and a lot more, and the discussion I know will carry on and on. So thank you, Sean. I'll pass over to Janet now.
Thank you, Stephanie, and thank you, Sian, for a fantastic talk. It's really proved incredibly valuable. So, well, first question we have is, this is an incredibly valuable talk, and thank you for it. Our students at Queen Mary are often local and struggle with digital access. How do we bridge the gap between students who rely on campus for their digital access and those for whom mobility is a given and an asset?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think yeah, I mean, I think part of this is about kind of providing a flexibility as to choose when to be on campus and when to be online. And I know that has been a massive issue for many students over the last year who have been forced to be online and haven't necessarily had the connectivity or the kit to enable them to do so. So I think that they're alongside kind of developing these new kind of models for kind of more mobile educational offers. I think there comes a new kind of responsibility, I suppose, for universities to ensure that students do have, I mean, it's not just universities, government as well, to ensure that students have access to the technologies that they need, access to the bandwidth and the hardware and software that they need. So I think it's a vision which brings with it sort of multiple responsibilities as well.
So is there going to be a clash of stakeholders? Some stakeholders see university instrumentally, that it's there to provide accreditation, but the vision you're describing has different values at the heart altogether. Do you think there'll be that clash from stakeholders?
Yes, I mean, yeah, when you're talking about values, it's very difficult, isn't it, to kind of extract a set of values from a massive community. You know, in our case, kind of over 50 to 60,000 people. You know, there's no way in which everybody subscribes to those values. So that's where the onus on kind of developing really interesting, you know, co-design methodologies sit, so that you can do that in a responsible way. Because yes, of course, there are always going to be clashing views on this. I suppose I didn't come across very many people during near future teaching who saw the university only as, you know, a provider of accreditation. I think that the general sense was that people valued the university as a community of scholarship, and wanted to plan a future on the basis of that, and on the idea that we need to preserve that in ways which are, you know, sustainable. So I think you do your best to establish a kind of set of shared values. Yes, not everyone will agree, but I think it is possible to reach a fair consensus. But what that consensus will look like would be very different at Queen Mary, I should imagine, than what it was at Edinburgh. I just, you know, I don't know. I don't want to make any generalising claims for what we did at Edinburgh. The values kind of work for us.
Thank you. And got a couple around questions about staff here. So one says, hi there, this is really exciting stuff. Where do non-techie yet enthusiastic academics go next to learn more and experiment in all the areas that you're describing?
Well, I guess that's a question for you and Stephanie, maybe rather than me. I mean, I could give that answer for Edinburgh University, but I'm not quite sure what the situation is in at Queen Mary's. I know that universities almost always have really strong communities of learning technologists, for example, which support academics in developing and thinking really creatively and interestingly about what they might do next. So there's, you know, if that resource is available, I think it's phenomenal. I mean, we have maker spaces as well, where people can go and experiment hands-on with some of this kind of stuff, and we also have communities of practitioners which are kind of brought together to talk about digital education and so on. So I know it's a slightly different picture in every university, but I think most of us do have things like that, and those are probably the best resources for experimentation and experience sharing.
Thank you. Yeah, and we'll definitely learn from the fantastic examples that you've shared today. Got one here. I'm a lecturer in drama, and we're adapting to digital learning, but social presence feels important for so many reasons. How do you see the role of drama and other arts and creative subjects in this new world?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's one that we've been thinking about a lot in relation to the Edinburgh Futures Institute. So the Futures Institute is a brand new institute at Edinburgh with a brand new, well, not a brand new building, it's a conversion of an old Victorian building, but a brand new conversion in which we want to do all kinds of new kinds of interdisciplinary teaching and interdisciplinary research. And part of what we want to develop for the Futures Institute is a way of bringing students together regardless of whether they're on campus or off campus. So and we have many colleagues working in creative arts, drama, design, and so on, to think about how we might do that. I don't think that we're ever going to not want to have live drama, for example, but I do think that we've seen over the last year really interesting kind of innovation coming from the creative sector on kind of hybrid events, hybrid theatre, hybrid music, and I think that we can take aspects of that into a kind of thinking about what a hybrid, more developed hybrid pedagogy might look like for arts type programs. I think it's an interesting challenge, and some of it might be about actual social presence, so students being in buildings, but other aspects of it might be about finding and building in technologies which can help create social presence among distributed cohorts, and I think that's very possible now too. So I think it's quite an exciting set of questions emerging from that. It's a good question, thank you.
Yeah, and can I build on that question? It's students love the social context of a campus and the shared lived experience when they come to university. That's shared, and you were talking there sort of about building that social context online as well. But what is your opinion about that? The sort of social development, the shared lived experience that the student gets from, and how can that play in this new world?
Yeah, no, I think there's a tendency to assume that kind of social lived experience can only happen on campus, and of course it does happen to a very large extent on campus, and it should continue to do so. But I think social engagement, social community, a sense of community can emerge online as well. It takes a different kind of pedagogy and a different kind of support to enable it, but I think it is possible. I also think that the new kind of highly mobile kinds of models that I've been talking about are suitable for some and not for others. So, postgraduate students, for example, particularly post-experience students, I think maybe benefit more from this idea of this kind of hybrid model where there's a greater choice about whether to come to campus or not be on campus. There's less campus dependency probably among postgraduate students, whereas undergraduate students, I think the kind of mobility that they want is slightly different. It's the ability to be mobile enough that they can do, that they can keep a job and study while they study, or mobile enough that they can catch up on lectures from home or while they're on the move if they need to. So I think there are different types of mobility, and different types of mobility will fit for different types of cohort. And I'm certainly not suggesting that I want to do away with the campus at any point. I really don't. I think it's essential.
Thank you. I've got a question here about, it says, it seems to me that universities have slowly slipped from being a critic of society to being a guardian of society. Does this technology or this future you're describing offer the chance to change that?
I'm not quite sure what guardian of society means. I guess I'm not sure that question seems to me to relate to the values which underpin universities rather than necessarily to technology as such. I mean, you know, I think universities should be to the side of and able to critique and criticise and comment on what's happening in society, but that's a very kind of values-driven kind of issue, and I think it goes beneath the choices we make about technology. I don't think it kind of. I think that's the way to think about it. The values should be driving the technological choices.
Yeah, and it's like that, embedding the value system into, you know, both the digital and on-campus experience alike. Yeah, I'm just reading. There's quite a few questions. I think you've answered this. There's quite a few questions about this. You know, how do we minimise the inequalities and gaps for students that have less access to social mobility? There's quite a lot. I'm not sure if I asked that earlier, but I just wanted to check in because we have quite a few questions around that social mobility and the inequalities.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what I was saying about mobility in the context of this talk was really mobility as in kind of the ability to move about rather than specifically social mobility. I realise there are lots of issues that cluster around that. I mean, I don't have a single answer to that question. I think what I said earlier was that if we want to develop these new kind of mobile flexible models, we have to an extent take responsibility for making sure that our students are able to access them. And I think again we saw that a lot over the last year, that universities had to take steps to ensure that students could access the environments they needed to access to continue with their study, and I think that need will grow over the coming years as these kind of post-digital methods kind of take hold.
Thank you. I got a question here about where can universities share what they learn from their approaches to future learning? So obviously you're here today sharing what you've learned, but where's the space for universities to share this? That's one question.
I think it gets shared to sort of at multiple levels. I think at the level of academics, quite often, you know, at conferences and so on, we talk about teaching methods. There are conferences that are dedicated to talking about teaching methods and digital education. There are quite a few of them. Some are more research focused than others. You know, I suppose there are institutional forums for universities to discuss these things, like Russell Group and so on. So I think there are various places in which universities come together to share these experiences, and it's, you know, from the individual to the organisational level. Maybe we could do more of it. I don't know. I mean, yeah, there are organisations which do kind of facilitate some of this, Advanced HE and JISC and so on. So we do have an infrastructure for sharing. Yeah. Yeah,
and I think it's maybe a role of academies or places like to share those platforms where they exist, and that it's wider understood across different staff groups that there are these communities of practice. Yeah, I'm just looking. I think just ask one last one. Yeah, so the last one is about maintaining the benefits of how can you create online community? On campus, you would meet people outside of your lectures that, you know, that bumping into people that are not in your classroom, you know, they're on the campus. How do you create that environment online where they meet a wider set of people? So, you know, obviously they attend classes and things, but outside of that, do you have mechanisms, or do you experience mechanisms to have that wider network, a broader network?
Yeah, it's a really good question. This sort of serendipity sort of thing, where you bump into people, or you meet in the kitchen, or you meet in the cafe. I mean, I suppose one of the primary modes for that at the moment is social media. You know, whether you love it or you hate it, you do bump into people in social media environments and social media contexts. I think so. another way in which we might enable that, I think through the last year, some really interesting new kind of video sort of gathering technologies have emerged, like wonder.me and Gather, you know, where you can go into a kind of a virtual room, and you have the agency to move around the room and bump into people and have conversations with them in a much more kind of organic, fluid way. So I think some really interesting new technologies are emerging to enable that kind of serendipitous kind of bumping into people thing to happen. Of course, it's not the same as physically bumping into people, but I think there are other different, sometimes better, sometimes worse ways in which technology can help with that.
Thank you so much, Sian. I've got a lot of thank yous and very inspiring in the questions. So thank you so much for this incredibly thought-provoking talk and your vision of the future and how we can take some agency in that. I think that's so important. And I just want to thank everybody online for attending. This is the 15th annual Drapers lecture. So huge thanks to Sian and huge thanks to everybody that attended. And it's just been incredibly thought-provoking and given us a lot to think about, a lot. We'll be talking a lot about your talk for quite some time, and I can see that Stephanie's nodding there. We'll be talking about this quite. So thank you very much, Sian.
Thanks, Janet. Thanks for having me.